It is 7:28 a.m., June 4th, 1942. On the bridge of the flagship Akagi, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo is handed a chilling radio message from a scout plane. Unknown American ships have just been sighted on his flank. In less than 3 hours, 3 of Japan's most powerful aircraft carriers will be reduced to burning steel tombs. But right now, Nagumo doesn't know if this American force includes a carrier, where the exact threat lies, or what single decision can possibly save his fleet. The clock on the greatest naval disaster in Japanese history has just started ticking. For decades, the Battle of Midway has been told almost exclusively as a miraculous American victory, a triumph forged by brilliant intelligence officers breaking codes in a dark basement in Hawaii, perfectly timed to exploit a fatal moment of Japanese hesitation. It is often summarized as the day one man's chronic indecision lost the Pacific War.
But that popular narrative relies entirely on the comfort of hindsight. Instead, we are going to strip away the omniscient perspective and experience Midway as a high-stakes military thriller unfolding minute by minute on the bridge of the Akagi. We will confront the agonizing reality of carrier warfare, where planes cannot simply be launched with the snap of a finger, and where every piece of information arrives fragmented and terrifyingly late. The ultimate question we must answer is this: did Admiral Nagumo actually destroy the Japanese fleet through sheer incompetence and frozen indecision, or was there already no way out? Was he trapped in a scenario where every available choice led to catastrophe because the entire operation was fundamentally broken from the start?
To understand why Nagumo found himself paralyzed on that shattered bridge, we have to look at the elaborate, inflexible snare set for him, not by the Americans waiting over the horizon, but by his own supreme commander, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was revered as a naval genius, but Operation M1 was less a stroke of tactical brilliance and more an intricately constructed fatal clockwork. Yamamoto wanted to draw the remnants of the United States Pacific Fleet into a decisive final battle of annihilation. Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of coral guarding the western approach to Hawaii, was simply the bait. But rather than massing his overwhelming naval superiority into a single, unstoppable fist, Yamamoto fell victim to the Japanese Navy's deep institutional obsession with elaborate deception. He fractured his massive armada into sprawling, isolated task forces spread across thousands of miles of the Pacific Ocean. A northern force was detached to attack the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, a diversion that siphoned away critical ships and aircraft. Furthermore, Yamamoto himself commanded the main body, a mighty surface fleet built around the colossal new battleship Yamato.
But instead of positioning these heavily armored dreadnoughts close enough to protect the fragile aircraft carriers or lend their massive anti-aircraft batteries to the defense, Yamamoto deliberately kept them trailing a staggering 300 miles behind Nagumo's spearhead. He believed this vast distance would conceal his true strength from the Americans until they were already engaged. In reality, it ensured that when the crisis came, the most powerful guns in the Japanese arsenal would be sailing completely out of range, utterly useless to the men fighting and dying on the front lines. Yamamoto's entire rigid timetable was anchored to a single catastrophic assumption. He firmly believed the American aircraft carriers were still safely docked at Pearl Harbor, licking their wounds and paralyzed by caution.
He assumed Nagumo would casually bomb Midway into submission, establish a beachhead, and then have days to wait for the American fleet to slowly steam out in response. Relying entirely on this fantasy, Yamamoto sent Nagumo into the vanguard with a weakened hand. Just a month prior, at the Battle of the Coral Sea, the Japanese carrier force had suffered its first real bruising. The carrier Shokaku had taken heavy bomb damage, and while her sister ship, Zuikaku, was physically intact, her elite air groups had been severely depleted. Instead of delaying the Midway operation to consolidate his forces and rebuild those shattered air wings, Yamamoto stubbornly adhered to the schedule.
Nagumo's famed Kido Butai, the devastating first air fleet that had decimated Pearl Harbor with 6 fleet carriers, sailed into the unknown waters around Midway with only 4: Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu. What the Japanese High Command could not see was that the thick veil of operational secrecy they so deeply relied upon had already been torn to shreds. In a dimly lit basement in Hawaii, known as Station HYPO, American codebreakers had cracked the Japanese naval cipher JN-25. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the commander of the Pacific Fleet, was not sitting blindly in port. He was reading fragments of Yamamoto's mail when the intercepts revealed a massive impending strike on a target designated AF. The Americans needed absolute confirmation. They transmitted a fake, uncoded radio message complaining that Midway's freshwater distillation plant was broken. 2 days later, a Japanese intelligence intercept faithfully reported to Tokyo that target AF was running short of water. The trap was verified. Knowing exactly when and where the blow would fall, Nimitz ruthlessly committed every operational asset he possessed. He sent the carriers Enterprise and Hornet to wait in ambush in the waters northeast of Midway. But 3 carriers were needed to stand a fighting chance against Nagumo's 4. The Yorktown, heavily damaged at Coral Sea and estimated by the Japanese to be sitting on the bottom of the ocean, had limped back into Pearl Harbor, leaking oil and trailing a massive slick. Navy engineers estimated it would take 3 months to repair her in dry dock. Nimitz gave them 3 days. In a frantic, superhuman effort of round-the-clock welding and jury-rigging, the Yorktown was patched up, refueled, and sent steaming out to sea, with civilian contractors still working inside her hull. As Vice Admiral Nagumo stood on the bridge of the Akagi in the pre-dawn darkness of June 4th, he was entirely oblivious to the lethal reality surrounding him. His orders were rigid, demanding a strike on the Midway defenses, while strictly reserving half of his aircraft armed with anti-ship torpedoes just in case the American fleet eventually showed up days later.
He was executing a script that had already been read by the enemy. He did not know that the element of surprise was gone. He did not know that his strike force was under constant, invisible surveillance. And most fatally, he had absolutely no idea that 3 American aircraft carriers were already sitting quietly in the cold waters, just northeast of Midway, waiting for him to expose his vulnerability. For the first few hours of that fateful morning, the grand illusion of total Japanese control held together perfectly. The Dawn launched flawlessly. The engines roared to life, and the first massive wave of bombers and fighters lifted off the wooden decks, forming up in the breaking light and turning toward the tiny atoll. The rigid timetable was unfolding exactly as Yamamoto had designed it. It was only when that first strike actually reached the skies over Midway that the master plan finally collided with reality, and the first deadly cracks began to form. The initial strike, led by Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, hammered the American installations on Midway, but as the smoke cleared, it was obvious the island's airfield was still fiercely operational. At exactly 7 a.m., Tomonaga keyed his radio and transmitted a message that would inadvertently seal the fate of the Japanese fleet. There is need for a second attack.
On the flag bridge of the Akagi, Nagumo absorbed the report. Yamamoto's master plan dictated that half of the Japanese aircraft must be held in reserve on the hangar decks, armed with anti-ship torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, just in case the American fleet made a surprise appearance. But Yamamoto had also assured Nagumo that the Americans were safely anchored hundreds of miles away in Hawaii. To Nagumo, the immediate, proven threat was the unsinkable aircraft carrier of Midway itself. Acting on the only solid intelligence he had, Nagumo made the most logical and ultimately fatal tactical decision of the morning. At 7:15 a.m., he ordered his reserve strike force to be stripped of their anti-ship weapons and rearmed with high-explosive land bombs to finish off the atoll. Below decks, the enclosed hangars of the 4 Japanese carriers instantly transformed into deafening, chaotic assembly lines. Arming an aircraft in 1942 was not a simple switch. It required dozens of aviation mechanics sweating in confined spaces, manually unbolting massive 900-pound torpedoes from the bellies of the bombers. These delicate, highly volatile weapons had to be carefully lowered onto specialized dollies, wheeled out of the way, and replaced with heavy land bombs hoisted up from the magazines. It was an exhausting, precision-heavy process that demanded time, the one resource Nagumo was about to abruptly run out of. Exactly 13 minutes into this frantic rearming cycle, a communications officer arrived on the bridge with a decoded radio intercept. It came from a scout float plane launched by the heavy cruiser Tone. That specific scout had been delayed by a jammed catapult, taking off half an hour behind schedule and throwing a blind spot into the Japanese search grid. Now, at 7:28 a.m., the delayed pilot transmitted a message that completely shattered the morning's confidence. Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships, bearing 010 degrees, 240 miles from Midway. The command staff on the Akagi froze. The foundational premise of the entire operation was wiped out in a single sentence. An American fleet was on their flank, but the scout plane had provided agonizingly vague details. Were they just cruisers and destroyers, or was there an aircraft carrier lurking among them? Nagumo was instantly trapped in a tactical nightmare. He was facing an unknown naval threat, but his reserve planes were stuck below deck, halfway through being stripped of the exact weapons required to sink warships. Staring at a fragmented scouting report, the admiral was suddenly forced into an agonizing sequence of impossible choices, strictly governed by the unforgiving laws of early carrier warfare. The popular armchair critique of Nagumo is devastatingly simple. He should have immediately launched everything he had at the reported American ships. But that conclusion ignores the unforgiving mechanical reality of a 1942 flight deck. A carrier is not a rifle that can simply be pointed and fired. It is an industrial logistics hub balanced precariously on the open ocean. To launch an attack, Nagumo could not just push a button. His planes were currently crammed inside the hangar decks. They had to be hoisted up, one by one, on slow hydraulic elevators to the flight deck. Once topside, they had to be manually pushed into precise formations, fueled, warmed up, and launched directly into the wind. This intricate ballet took at least 45 minutes of uninterrupted preparation. At 7:45 a.m., Nagumo ordered the rearming process halted and reversed. The mechanics, already exhausted from wrestling heavy bombs, now had to unbolt them, find the torpedoes they had just stowed, and start over. But this logistical nightmare was only half the problem. Even if Nagumo somehow managed to launch his bombers immediately, with whatever weapons were currently strapped to them, he faced a brutal mathematical reality in the sky above him. Lieutenant Tomonaga's first strike wave, dozens of bombers and fighters returning from Midway, was already approaching the fleet. Their fuel gauges were critically low, and many aircraft were damaged. If Nagumo covered his flight decks with reserve bombers preparing for a launch, he would eliminate any space for Tomonaga's returning planes to land. He would be condemning over 100 of his own veteran aviators to ditch in the sea. Furthermore, the intelligence picture remained maddeningly blurry. It wasn't until 8:20 a.m., nearly an hour after the initial sighting, that the scout plane finally confirmed the presence of at least one aircraft carrier in the American formation. Nagumo now knew the supreme danger he faced, but the enemy was still too far away to pinpoint easily, and launching an uncoordinated, poorly armed strike with no fighter escort against an alerted American fleet was tactical suicide. He made the agonizing choice to clear the decks, recover Tomonaga's strike force, and steam north to buy time to organize a massive, decisive, fully armed counterblow. But the enemy did not give him time to organize. The Americans had already found him. Beginning just before 8 a.m., the Japanese fleet was subjected to a relentless, uncoordinated series of attacks from Midway-based aircraft. Army B-26 bombers, Marine Corps Dauntless dive bombers, and ancient Vindicator bombers descended on the Kido Butai. These attacks were piecemeal, poorly executed, and strategically desperate. The American pilots flew straight into walls of anti-aircraft fire and swarms of defending Zero fighters. They did not score a single hit on the Japanese carriers, yet these failed attacks acted as a fatal disruptor. To evade the incoming bombs and torpedoes, the massive Japanese carriers were forced to execute violent, high-speed evasive maneuvers. The ships heeled sharply, tearing through the water in erratic zigzags. Down in the enclosed hangar decks, this violent motion was catastrophic. The mechanics trying to carefully load highly volatile torpedoes onto airplanes were thrown to the steel deck. Heavy ordnance rolled dangerously. The delicate, time-consuming rearming process was repeatedly halted. Nagumo was trapped in a defensive crouch, unable to spot his strike force while under constant assault. The pressure intensified exponentially just after 9:20 a.m., when the first waves of carrier-based aircraft from the American fleet finally arrived. But these were not the highly coordinated strikes the Japanese were used to. They were squadrons of slow, obsolete Devastator torpedo bombers, arriving low over the water without fighter protection. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, dozens of nimble Zero fighters, pounced on them. The slaughter was absolute. Squadron after squadron of American torpedo bombers was decimated, shot out of the sky before they could even release their weapons. The Japanese gunners and pilots fought with lethal efficiency, filling the ocean with burning American planes. On the bridge of the Akagi, it appeared they were surviving the onslaught. By 10 a.m., the last of the torpedo bombers had been swatted from the sky, and they still hadn't taken a single hit. The skies above the fleet seemed temporarily clear. The Zeros, having chased the American torpedo planes right down to the waves,
were now skimming the surface of the ocean, far below their optimal patrol altitude. Nagumo finally had his window. The violent maneuvering ceased. The elevators began to hum, bringing fully armed bombers up to the flight decks. In a few more minutes, the Japanese fleet would launch a devastating counterpunch that would rip the heart out of the American Navy. The worst seemed to be over, but this is exactly where the great myth of Midway diverges violently from the historical reality. For decades, the popular narrative has insisted that at 10:20 a.m., the flight decks of the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were perfectly packed with armed aircraft, engines warming, just 5 short minutes away from launching a glorious, battle-winning counterattack. The story claims that the Americans struck at the exact second the Japanese were most lethal. The reality on those ships was far more chaotic and far more vulnerable. The flight decks were not neatly arranged with strike planes ready to roar into the sky. They were caught in a desperate, disorganized logistical traffic jam. Because of the constant, violent, evasive maneuvers required to dodge the American torpedo planes, the delicate process of refueling and arming the aircraft down in the enclosed hangar decks had been severely delayed. Rather than a pristine strike force waiting on the flight deck, the Japanese were trapped mid-cycle. Mechanics were still frantically pushing aircraft around the hangars. Fuel hoses were snaked across the decks, pumping highly flammable aviation gas into empty tanks. The heavy torpedoes and bombs that had been unloaded earlier in the morning had not been safely stowed in the heavily armored magazines deep in the ship. There simply hadn't been time. They were left sitting on carts right in the middle of the hangars, or shoved carelessly against the bulkheads, surrounded by fully fueled airplanes. Nagumo was not 5 minutes away from launching a triumphant strike. He was sitting on top of a floating, unarmored powder keg, desperately trying to restore order to a fleet that had been violently off balance for over 2 hours. Down at sea level, the Japanese gunners and the exhausted Zero pilots skimming the waves were cheering, celebrating the total destruction of the last American torpedo squadrons. They believed their fierce defense had saved the fleet. They were completely oblivious to the fact that their frantic, twisting maneuvers and their low-altitude dogfights had inadvertently drawn a massive, invisible bullseye on the decks of their own carriers, leaving the sky directly above them entirely unprotected, just as a new, lethal threat silently broke through the high clouds. That lethal threat was a desperate, fuel-starved strike force of American dive bombers from the Enterprise and Yorktown. For hours, they had been blindly searching empty ocean, running dangerously close to empty, and were on the verge of aborting their mission. But just moments earlier, their flight commander, Wade McCluskey, had spotted a single white streak carving a path through the vast blue water. It was the wake of the Japanese destroyer Arashi, speeding north at maximum velocity to rejoin the main fleet after unsuccessfully hunting an American submarine. Trusting his instincts, McCluskey followed that white arrow on the surface. At 10:22 a.m., the American squadrons broke through the scattered clouds at 15,000 feet. What they saw below was a bomber pilot's ultimate fantasy. The legendary vanguard of the Imperial Navy was spread out against the dark ocean, their massive yellow wooden flight decks painted with giant red rising suns, and the airspace above them was completely, miraculously empty. Because the Japanese combat air patrol had just been dragged down to the waves to slaughter the torpedo planes, there was not a single Zero in position to intercept the incoming dive bombers. The trap had not been perfectly orchestrated by Nimitz, but it was flawlessly executed by chance. Pushing their noses down, the Dauntlesses rolled into near-vertical 70-degree dives, their perforated dive flaps emitting a terrifying, unmistakable shriek as they plummeted. On the Japanese ships, lookouts screamed frantic warnings, but it was too late. There was no time to maneuver. Within 5 catastrophic minutes, the balance of power in the Pacific was violently rewritten. The Kaga was obliterated first, struck by at least 4 heavy bombs that shattered her flight deck and immediately ignited the gasoline-soaked hangars below. Seconds later, 3 armor-piercing bombs tore the Soryu apart, but the most fatal blow was delivered directly to Nagumo's own flagship. A single 1,000-pound bomb, dropped by Lieutenant Richard Best, smashed through the wooden flight deck of the Akagi and detonated in the upper hangar. It was the fatal spark hitting the powder keg. The unsecured torpedoes,
the hastily stacked land bombs, and the tangled fuel hoses that Nagumo had been unable to safely stow suddenly erupted in a sympathetic detonation of apocalyptic proportions. Fully fueled aircraft exploded in a chain reaction, tearing the ship apart from the inside out. Within seconds, the Akagi was transformed from the invincible pride of the Imperial Navy into a raging, uncontrollable inferno of melting steel and aviation gas. From the bridge, Admiral Nagumo watched in stunned, paralyzed silence as decades of Japanese naval supremacy were immolated right before his eyes.
The blistering heat and toxic black smoke quickly overwhelmed the command center, forcing a devastated Nagumo to climb out a window and evacuate his burning flagship by rope. As he was transferred to a light cruiser, looking back at the three colossal pillars of fire towering over the Pacific, the battle appeared completely lost. The mighty First Air Fleet was dead. Yet, several miles away, operating independently and outside the immediate American drop zone, one lone Japanese aircraft carrier had survived the 5-minute slaughter untouched, and her commander was already preparing to exact a brutal, bloody toll. That lone survivor was the Hiryu.
Under the command of Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, she did not retreat into the safety of the horizon. Instead, Yamaguchi immediately launched two desperate, highly concentrated, retaliatory strikes. Following the returning American aircraft straight back to their source, the Japanese dive bombers and torpedo planes found the USS Yorktown. In two vicious assaults, they hammered the American carrier, ultimately leaving her a crippled, listing derelict that would soon sink. But Yamaguchi's vengeance was brutally short-lived. By late afternoon, American scouts located the Hiryu, and a massive wave of dive bombers from the Enterprise and Hornet descended, smashing her flight deck and condemning the final piece of the Kido Butai to the bottom of the Pacific. The disaster was total. Looking back at the morning's agonizing decisions on the bridge of the Akagi, the true meaning of the tragedy finally emerges from the smoke. Admiral Nagumo was neither a coward nor a fool. He was an officer trapped inside a systemic failure of his own military's making. He was forced to operate a massive industrial war machine within a rigid command structure that demanded absolute secrecy, a perfect timetable, and a completely passive enemy.
Yamamoto's elaborate plan left Nagumo with zero margin for error when reality inevitably struck. When the scout plane finally broke the silence at 7:28 a.m., the trap had already closed. The ashes of the Japanese carrier fleet reveal a profound lesson about the nature of military planning, a strategy built entirely on the assumption that the enemy will behave exactly as you wish is not a plan, it is a suicide pact. Ultimately, the Battle of Midway was not lost because of a single hesitant order on the flag bridge, nor was it doomed by one delayed scout plane.
It was lost because the Imperial Japanese Navy engineered a master plan so incredibly brittle that it condemned its frontline commanders the very second reality intervened. When that first unexpected radio transmission finally shattered the morning silence, Admiral Nagumo was not robbed of a guaranteed victory. He was simply left to decide which of his impossible choices would lead the First Air Fleet into the exact same unavoidable catastrophe.